Hello, everybody. I'm Rabbi Gili Tzidkiyahu. I'm the newly appointed rabbi for Nottingham Liberal Synagogue. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight as part of this educational, Liberal Judaism's educational hub. And you've all made a choice to devote your evening today to learning and not to football. So well done for that. And it's lovely to see you here. And knowing our teacher tonight, Rabbi Gabriel Kanter-Webber, I'm sure you made a wise choice. Rabbi Gabriel grew up in liberal Judaism, was ordained this summer at Leo Baeck College, and is now a rabbi for Brighton and Hove Progressive Synagogue. And Gabriel, you will be speaking tonight about liberal Jewish ethics.
Thank you. So Rabbi Gili said that everyone has made a choice to be here. I'm not sure if that applies to my dad, who's lurking without his camera on. I think he might have a sense of obligation, but nonetheless, it's lovely to see so many faces here. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'd really like to throw it open for people's questions, comments, thoughts, and so on. And I want to start by taking us back a little way to October, to the middle of October, when eco-activists from the Just Stop Oil campaign threw tomato soup over Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers painting in the National Gallery. The activists' Twitter account claimed that they had done this to demonstrate that they had chosen life over art. While none of us doubt the vital importance of climate action to the preservation of human life, that tweet didn't really explain anything. Their motivation for throwing soup at a Van Gogh painting remains wholly unclear. Was it a protest against oil paintings? Was it something to do with sunflower oil? Critics of the protest would argue that such actions are at best pointless, and at worst likely to alienate potential supporters of eco-campaigns. However, it's impossible to deny that the activists were genuine and sincere believers in their cause, and that they were willing to risk the most severe personal consequences, criminal prosecution, in order to promote it. Now, Judaism knows a thing or two about climate emergencies, and if there was one person in the whole of our tradition who had the greatest opportunity to be an effective eco-activist, it was Noah. And yet he wasn't. At no stage in his story did he protest against God's plan to flood the world and drown all its inhabitants. What went wrong? Noah was, we're told by Genesis, Ish Tzadik Tamim Haya Bidorato. The JPS translates this as a righteous man blameless in his age. That seemingly superfluous word, Doratov, in his age at the end of the verse, has always been slightly puzzling. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan takes it to be a mild criticism of Noah. He was considered righteous in his particular generation, but in any other generation, any less evil time, Noah would not be particularly special. It's possible, though, to be more critical of Noah. And that is exactly the line taken by the 20th century commentator, Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin. His commentary Oznaim LaTorah was published in the 1960s, and it is by far the best commentary you've never heard of. It's shamefully little known. I myself only discovered it by complete accident a few months ago, but it's full of the most beautiful and varied gems of learning. And Rabbi Sorotskin interprets that verse about Noah completely differently. While everyone else takes it to say, Ish Tzadik, a righteous man, comma, Tamim Haya B'dorotav, who was blameless in his age, it can also be read with the comma placed in a different location, such that Noah was an Ish Tzadik Tamim, an innocently righteous man. So what does it mean to be innocently righteous? According to Rabbi Sorotskin, there are two ways of worshipping God. Firstly, the path of innocence. One who chooses this isolates themselves from everything except Torah and prayer, and does not engage with other people, even for the purpose of bringing them closer to God. The second way is living life as a battle against wrongdoing. The righteous ones who choose this option go out and reprove evildoers to their face without fearing the consequences. Thus, the phrase innocently righteous denotes one who worships in innocent solitude, who does not confront the trials of everyday life. And elsewhere he elaborated, there's something quite remarkable about Noah's life, his complete lack of influence on the people around him. Here we have someone who was the greatest of his generation, whose entire life was guided by his belief in God, which gave him the strength to swim against the current of his wicked fellows. Yet we find that he has not a single friend or student who was won over by him. This is extraordinary. A father who knew how to raise and educate 3 upstanding children in an age of wickedness. He must have been a teacher and a skilled mentor like no other. So why didn't he manage to influence the people of his generation? We must conclude that Noah did not try to teach his contemporaries about morality. He would stay away from them and their misdeeds, seclude himself in his house, and worship God from there. He lacked the courage to go outside and speak with the evildoers and oppressors, and to rebuke them, afraid that they would argue back. After all, it is easier to worship God while resting in one's room than to step into the shuk and wage a harsh war against the wrongdoers there. I find that an incredibly powerful passage. It's a character assassination of Noah, no doubt, but I think one that is eminently justified. There's something infuriatingly self-satisfied and holier-than-thou about his refusal to peer outside the bubble of his own perfectly moral and upstanding family. The irony he never understood, though, is that living in self-imposed seclusion from the real world and turning one's back on the affairs of wider society, in fact disqualified him from being judged perfectly moral. As long ago as 1953, Rabbi Israel Matuk, one of the founders of our own liberal Judaism, wrote that the knowledge of God includes a moral dynamism. It generates the power for righteousness. Noah was not dynamic, and he exercised no power. He understood right and wrong, but he didn't tell anyone. That was his misjudgment. He had deep ethical understanding, but failed to use it in any sort of practical way. When you've got it, flaunt it. In contrast to Noah's self-indulgent inaction, there are countless examples of Jews who have boldly stepped out into the public domain, into the shuk. Let's focus on 2, one ancient and one modern. Even before his revelation at the burning bush, Moses felt himself duty-bound. He's the ancient one, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. Moses felt himself duty-bound to improve the lives of Egypt's Hebrew slaves. The Midrash records 3 different ideas of how he might have gone about this. Moses would see the Israelites suffering and weep. There is nothing more demanding than carrying clay. So he would take it upon his own shoulders and help them with their burdens. Or an alternative, he would see a heavy burden on the shoulders of a child and a light burden being borne by an adult, and he would leave his attendants and go and swap their burdens while pretending that he was carrying out Pharaoh's orders. Or another alternative, he saw that the Israelites never got any rest. So he went to Pharaoh and said, "If we do not allow the slaves even a day's rest, they will surely die. But if we release them for 1 day a week, they will not die." Pharaoh replied, "Go and do as you have suggested." Thus Moses invented Shabbat to give them rest. These 3 alternatives denote hugely contrasting approaches to enacting social change. In the first scenario, Moses simply pitched in to offer direct, if limited, help to individuals. In the second, he used his institutional power, or purported power, to offer targeted support to those who were especially vulnerable. And in the third, he used his privileged access to decision takers to create lasting change. Yet what they all have in common is Moses discerning the wrongness of slavery imposed on him an obligation to step outside the confines of his own life and take active steps to do what he could to ameliorate the conditions of the slaves around him. It was not enough that Moses himself did not keep or mistreat slaves. Sitting idly by and feeling pleased with his own moral standards was not an option, all the more so given the power that he had as a prince to advocate for change. This is consistent with the Talmudic dictum, "When the community is deeply suffering, nobody may say, 'I will go home and eat and drink and revel in the peace of my own life.'" The modern example is Helen Suzman. Helen Suzman was a Jewish politician born to a family of Lithuanian immigrants who spent 3 decades as South Africa's only anti-apartheid member of parliament. Famed for her sharp tongue and her fearless pursuit of justice, in one debate she told John Vorster, the Prime Minister, that he could only learn what it was like to live life as a black South African if he went to visit the black townships, heavily disguised as a human being. She spent her career enduring threats and misogynistic abuse. Despite a secular upbringing, she freely ascribed her commitment to racial equality as stemming from her Jewish background. My knowledge of the Jewish experience of persecution, she wrote in her autobiography, heightened my awareness of the evils of race discrimination. Yet there were plenty of other Jewish South Africans with the same ethnic history of persecution who somehow missed the lesson about racial equality. Rabbi Ben Isaacson was in the middle of delivering an anti-apartheid sermon to his synagogue in Johannesburg when he was sacked on the spot, literally, by the congregation's president, Percy Yutar, who later went on to be the prosecutor at the trial of Nelson Mandela. Apparently, he never got the memo. The official leadership of the Jewish community may not have been actively pro-apartheid, but it quiesced in it and did not want to rock the boat. In my view, this was in some ways even less creditable than Percy Yutar's active support for apartheid. At least he did what he believed in, vile as those beliefs were. Most of the rest of the communal leadership sat quietly in their synagogues, stifled their moral instincts, and refrained from going out into the shuk. Neither Helen Suzman nor Moses sat on their laurels being innocently righteous. But what actually is the opposite of innocence? The word used to describe Noah, tamim, comes from the root taf mem mem, meaning perfect or blameless. But it means this in the sense of childlike innocence. Alternative definitions of the same root might include simple, innocuous, and artless. Do we actually want to be these things? Even setting aside artless, it's hard to read, "Here lies Rabbi Gabriel, he was simple and innocuous," as being a complimentary epitaph. In a few biblical verses, the opposite of taf mem mem is given as ayin kuf shin, typically rendered in English as twisted or crooked. It may seem strange to adopt such a word as a positive, but then again it seems strange that the Torah uses tamim, innocent, as a damning criticism. And there is, after all, something intrinsically crooked, cunning, or wily about many forms of political engagement. Helen Suzman made extensive use of parliamentary procedures' various quirks in order to get her points across, despite the apartheid government's attempts to silence her. Moses persuaded Pharaoh to lighten the Hebrew slaves' burdens under the pretense of making the workforce more efficient. Whenever we go out into the shuk to confront the world around us as it is, we must be shrewd and keep our wits about us. Liberal Judaism, I believe, demands then that we become tzadikim ikushim, crookedly righteous, combining the moral purity and unabashed virtue of Noah with the moral courage and tactical ingenuity of Helen Suzman. Rabbi Shoshana Conover has written, "We perpetuate humanity and holiness by humbling ourselves to one another. We need people who can help us most by challenging us to live up to our divine potential. Our intelligence and will must be employed in service of life, compassion, and righteousness. Our recognition of each other's value must compel us to act to ensure that this truth is represented in every society. We must use our power to amplify the power of others." In other words, engagement with the world around us, leaving the seclusion of our homes and going out into the shuk to grapple with intolerance, inequality, and oppression, is not just a moral duty, but a religious act. It is as much doing Jewish as reciting the Amidah is doing Jewish. A recent illustration of this principle is a lawsuit filed by 3 Reform rabbis in Florida, challenging abortion restrictions as a breach of their right to religious freedom. For Reform Jewish women, choosing whether or not to have an abortion is a religious act. For Reform rabbis, counseling congregants in such a situation is a religious act. Such acts, runs the plaintiff's persuasive argument, should be protected by the right to freedom of religion with the same strength as the right to wear a kippah or light Shabbat candles. The instinct to draw an artificial distinction between political acts and religious acts, though, rests not solely with the state of Florida, nor solely with Noah. All of us, myself included, have some tendency to distinguish between our political life, if we have one, and our religious life. This, I think, is a tendency to be challenged. Judaism is and is supposed to be all-encompassing. We are inheritors of blessings not just for overtly religious occasions, such as putting on a talit or blowing the shofar, but for all the other and varied experiences that life throws at us. There are brachot for seeing a tall person and brachot for doing a wee. Why should they not be joined by brachot for us to recite when engaging with the political world? Such moments being just as much emanations of the divine as a trip to the toilet. Voting is a religious act. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher natan yalu yocholet b'chira. We praise you, our God, for giving us the capacity to choose. Writing to an MP or councillor is a religious act. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher limdanu lachashov, lichtov, ulekanter et gedolei hador. We praise you, our God, for teaching us to think, to write, and to chide the powerful. Making a Freedom of Information Act request is a religious act. We praise you, eternal God, creator of curiosity and cooperation. Attending a protest or demonstration is a religious act. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher gedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lo ta'amod. We praise you, eternal God, you sanctify us by your commandments and enjoin us against standing by. I wrote all of these brachot, and you can make of them what you will. But what is absolutely certain is that Judaism has never come up with a bracha for sitting at home quietly and doing nothing. That simply isn't the Jewish way, and it particularly isn't the liberal Jewish way. Just as Noah cannot claim to have truly known God without understanding the moral dynamism, in Rabbi Mattock's words, that knowledge required of him, nor can we truly claim to believe in our values if we treat them merely as abstract concepts, but never seek to apply them to our fellow human beings. LJY Netzer is perhaps the part of our movement that is most active in this area. Take, for example, its recent protest outside the inhumane Manston Camp Detention Center. But it shouldn't just fall to our young people. As liberal Judaism enters its next 120 years, and as I leave the group able to describe themselves as liberal Judaism's young people, I would like to see us going on more protests, filing more lawsuits, seeking more legislative amendments, writing more columns in the national press. In many ways, Britain today is far more broken than it was in 1902 when this movement was founded. Granted, there have been many vital improvements: universal suffrage, a minimum wage, a Human Rights Act. Yet we now find ourselves in a nation marred by inequality, filled with bigotry, and heating up to the extent that life itself is under threat. It cannot be anything but incumbent on us as liberal Jews to reach back into our tradition and pull out those teachings and those stories, which will strengthen and embolden us to push for change. Rabbi Sorotskin said one more thing of interest to us. Noah's excuse for failing to reprove his contemporaries properly, he said, and lead them in ways of righteousness, is that he simply chose a path of seclusion and innocence. But while a private individual may choose such a life, a leader, one who was tasked in the womb with teaching their values, walking before the divine and making known God's presence, may not make such a choice. Liberal Judaism is a leader. Since its very earliest days in the womb of Lily Montagu's mind, liberal Judaism has been on the radical edge of our religion, going out into the shuk of the real world to promote our values and advocate for our principles. We have never been content to stay secluded indoors, muttering our prayers and then shedding our Jewish identity at the door. Rather, we've been crookedly righteous for 120 years, and long may it continue. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'd be really happy to hear people's thoughts, comments, outrage, agreement, or whatever other feelings I've managed to stir up. And I think Rabbi Gili is going to nominate people to speak.
I am. Thank you very much, Gabriel. This was fascinating, and I do hope that you wrote all these brachot and that we can all get them, because I'll be looking forward to an opportunity to use them. So thank you very much. So you can raise your hands either physically, like you do, Angela, or by Zoom. So we'll have Angela and then Ronnie. Then we'll see who would want to speak next. You're muted, Angela, so unmute yourself.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I found your discussion very interesting. Thank you. I wonder where you sit on the issue of the lesser evil, which essentially says that some degree of silence or collaboration with an injustice may be warranted for some larger good. And I'm thinking particularly of many, many years ago, I went to a talk by a Methodist minister who just returned from South Africa. And he made quite a big thing about having a meeting with South African anti-apartheid people in his garden. And he made it clear that it was in the garden because the rules said he couldn't invite such people into his house. And I found this quite unacceptable. But he justified it on the lesser evil argument. So would you mind commenting, please?
Thank you. And I think it's a really interesting question. Sorry, the image of having meetings in our garden rather than the house is bringing up pandemic memories for me rather than anything else. But I think the scenario you describe is a really interesting one. And I think there's two different prisms through which we might want to look at it. One is about the idea of trying to be effective. And that does sometimes require some level of compromise. But of course, the aim of everything we're talking about is effectiveness. I don't think people thought Noah should have gone out abusing people to get it off his chest, but rather he should have tried to reform them in an effective way to get them onto the boat, so to speak, or to avoid the flood. But I think the other principle is about what it means to taint yourself morally as well. And does holding a meeting in your garden mean you're collaborating with the rule that requires that or not? And I think that's a very difficult question, but I think the answer could well be maybe not. Maybe the important thing is actually having the meeting and being crooked within the rules, almost, in order to do what you can, and being creative in the way that we do our work in order to achieve what we want to achieve without getting ourselves into undue trouble. Just one very quick plug on the general topic of collaborating with evil. Rabbi Neil James has a wonderful session he teaches about the trolley problem in Jewish law, which is based on a number of texts in the Mishnah about if the Romans ask you to hand over one of your numbers, should you do it, and various different combinations of that. So I'd really recommend anyone to look that up. I think it's online, and that really closely goes to the idea of collaboration.
Just a very quick follow-up. Kant would say maybe the slippery slope.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Rabbi Gabriel, and Ronnie. Please present your question or comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Hi, it's nice to see you. Thank you. That was really inspiring. And I, believe it or not, have never heard liberal Judaism described as a radical movement before. And it's I really like that. I like it a lot. I was intrigued by your presentation of the Noah story, which is one I'm more familiar with than some of the others, because in a past life I used to write children's books, and I wrote several versions of the Noah story, and he's always presented as, you know, the consummate good man. And you know, to see him in a new light is, you know, it's interesting. And I wondered why, because it made me think of much later, and not in the Torah but in the prophets, where God tells Jonah, you know, no, you can't just hide away from this. You've got to go out and do what I tell you. Why was he not more why was God rewarded Noah? Did he reward him for his complacence and for his drawing back? Why did God not demand more of him? Is it because, as I also said in some of my retellings of the Noah story, the world was new? A long, long time ago when the world was new. So maybe, and Jonah takes place, of course, much later. So what's your take on that?
It's a really interesting question, but of course I might challenge the idea that Noah was actually rewarded, because on a personal level, I think it must been an absolutely ghastly experience having to be on a boat for 40 days with every animal in the world. And we do actually find tellings of that story where it was described as a huge ordeal and Noah didn't sleep a single wink and so on. But on a more practical level, was Noah rewarded or was the human race rewarded? Someone had to survive that flood in order for all of us to be here today. And maybe it was a case, almost to go back to Angela's question, of the lesser evil. You know, the least bad person was the sensible option to put on that boat, even if in any other time we would view them very critically. Again, that's a question of the ends justifying the means. And I think, you know, liberal Judaism wouldn't be here if Noah hadn't been on that boat. So maybe we can say that was a happy ending.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Gabriel. Tony, you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and some interesting thoughts that are emerging, I think. Just a comment, by the way, I also like the phrase radical Judaism, and radicals, of course, it's a very interesting word because, of course, it does mean going back to one's roots. And in that sense, radical, I think, is a good description of liberal Judaism, which was very much about getting to sort of core values and stripping away some of the things that had perhaps got in the way of its sort of value-based thinking over the centuries. But of course, in modern thinking, radical seems to have a very different meaning, which is all about, you know, almost taking protest to the street. It's about speaking out. It's not quite the same meaning anymore, but I quite like radical in both senses, applying to us as liberal Jews. But my question was related, and it's a question asked in some ignorance, but I tend to think of liberal Judaism's social engagement as very much a recent development, perhaps the last 20 or 30 years. I don't know if that's a bit unfair, but I was curious as to, you know, going back to the founders, the Lily Montagues and colleagues, did they, I mean, was social engagement really part of their thinking? Did they write on issues of social engagement, or were they, which is what I think, just much more focused on developing a strand of Judaism? I don't know to what extent they really were thinking about social engagement.
It's a really good question, and I suspect there are other people better qualified to talk about the history, but I think there were certainly forms of political and social engagement going all the way back. Like Lily Montagu, of course, like as a young Victorian woman, doing anything was a radical act, in fact, let alone creating a religious movement. And she was also extremely active in what I think Americans might refer to as street work. And she was very active in setting up youth groups and training up young women to be empowered figures and so on. And so I think that was definitely a form of social engagement. It wasn't lobbying Parliament, it wasn't suing people, but of course it was a very different world back then. And so I think we can give some level of credit where it's due. And similarly, sermons have always, in progressive synagogues, liberal and reform, been a way of promoting and speaking out around social issues and advocating for social change. And Rabbi Mark Saperstein has published compendia of sermons of like sort of pressure points in history, various ones. And many of those are speaking out on various issues. There's one in particular, I think it might have been Rabbi Bernard Hooker, I can't remember which liberal rabbi it was, but was speaking out against landlords in his congregation imposing exorbitant rent increases on their tenants, which is again very much the sort of thing that we'd be looking at. I also just want briefly to come back to that word radical, which, as you've said, is a complicated word. And I'm always in two minds about whether or not it's a good thing to be radical per se. Because one of the things about having values is you want other people to have those values. And so is it good to be radical because it means you're one of the few people with the right values? Or do you want to be less radical in that everyone else shares those values? Would we actually rather that the whole of the Jewish community wholeheartedly adopted same-sex marriage and all the other things that we do that make us radical? Yes, we would. But then again, does the fact that they've not done that mean we shouldn't be doing those things? No, it doesn't. And so again, I can see in a way that tension that Noah had, which was being in the minority? Do we want to luxuriate with being in the minority, or do we want to try and promote change? And I think we can strike a balance between those two.
Thank you.
Howard, please.
Hi, I'm the father who was called out at the start of this session as being here out of a sense of duty. Absolutely not. And in any case, the football has no appeal to me. And Gabe will be unsurprised to know that I'm not going to focus on the theology of this, of a very, very fascinating presentation, but picking up Angela's point about how doing things for the well, doing evil that good may come, or taking the lesser of two evils. The examples that you gave are all of trimming of that sort. I mean, the most radical of Moses's actions was, in effect, to persuade Pharaoh that slavery would be more sustainable if the slaves had a day off a week. It's like a sort of a kindly slave owner in the southern states of America in the 1850s, rather than anything more radical. Helen Sussman was not only not a member of the ANC, but was actually sort of pretty opposed to the ANC, was opposed to the things that, well, in modern times are called BDS, etc. And there's a fair amount of sort of anti-Helen Sussman feeling about, compared with, say, someone like Hilda Bernstein, another Jewish activist who was a sort of collaborator with Mandela. So how radical do you think? I mean, is it simply you always are going to have to choose how radical you choose to be, or is there any guidance that liberal Judaism might give on that question of how radical you might choose to be?
It's a really good question. And I think we need to distinguish between values and tactics. And so I think, for example, all of the South African anti-apartheid activists we've mentioned, from the ANC to Helen Suzman to Hilda Bernstein, they all shared similar values in terms of they wanted apartheid to end. And what we're then talking about is the sorts of tactics that they employed. And I'm wondering whether radicalness is actually on that axis at all, or whether it's more about the values that are there. Is wanting an end to apartheid radical, full stop? And then how you go about it is a different question. I think also we need to be really conscious that liberal Judaism's other values around the promotion of individual autonomy are really important here as well. And so individual liberal Jews are going to decide for themselves exactly what they want to do and how. And I think that's really important. So some people do have the luxury or the privilege of being able to speak out, or being able to go on protests and risk arrests in a way that other members simply will not. I'm very lucky to be employed by the sort of synagogue where I can say this stuff. I know that there are some colleagues in progressive synagogues, and certainly in non-progressive synagogues, where you can't get away with that sort of thing. And it's difficult to blame them, because people also have to pay their mortgages, feed their families. And so I'd really like to see liberal Judaism helping to support people wherever on that tactic spectrum they want to put themselves, obviously within some limits of violence and so on. But I think people have to decide for themselves. But I think liberal Judaism's job is to drive the values and the concept of tactics, maybe. The idea that there are things we should be doing, and what those are, people have to decide.
Fair enough.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Howard. Thank you, Gabriel. If more people would want to ask a question or comment, suggest, the stage is open.
Hi, Gabriel. Thanks. It's been a really good discussion. I've really enjoyed a lot of the commentary. Some of your comments are sparking with me, given I'm currently serving in the Royal Air Force. I find that when we talk about radical, I've taken an oath to God and to, as it was, the Queen, now the King, and their descendants, and the government and laws that are sustained over me. Now, within that aspect, and within what you're talking about and what you just said there about violence, non-violence, when I look at radicalism, I tend to see that as a, if you're taking it to the step that you're talking about active social disobedience, as it were, I tend to see that as being the negative side of radicalism, where we should be, as members of society, looking to enact the change that we wish to see through legal means, through discussion, rather than picketing, rather than disrupting, rather than potentially breaking the laws of the land as well. So at what point would you say that the class of radicalism is what you're looking at seeing?
Again, it's a really interesting question, and that issue of tactics is always going to be one of the most difficult ones and possibly one of the most divisive ones. So the specific sorts of activism that I happened to mention that I happened to write about in that paper were around filing lawsuits, going on protest, and those are things that tend to be legal. They might be disruptive to some measure or another, but they are legal. Protest is legal in this country. But some of the achievements that we looked at, so the end of apartheid, universal suffrage, they did actually only come about with some level of law breaking. To some extent, the suffragettes were not law-abiding people, and I don't think, looking back, we would necessarily class that as any bad thing. And so I guess this is a very long way of saying it's complicated, but I guess it's also a long way of saying that our values are probably not inconsistent with the sort of oath that you've sworn in principle. The idea that there is an oath that we owe loyalty to the state, to our religion, whatever we owe loyalty to, that loyalty has to be something greater than individual laws and regulations. Otherwise, of course, you're subject to the law anyway, whether or not you swear an oath. You're subject to whatever RAF regulations are called, the Queen's regulations. And the idea of the oath, I think, is deliberately intended to take us to some level of a higher plane, to the idea that there's some higher responsibility, higher power that we have. And it's that overarching idea of values rather than minutiae, which I think can maybe help to get us out of that dilemma.
Food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Gabriel. Thank you, John. Any other questions? Is there other hands that I'm missing? Any comments? Yes, Angela, please.
Just coming back full circle. I mean, I do believe there are cases where there's a categorical imperative for people to stand up and advance the principles and the values, but the principle of advancing a particular stance. And if that is condemning apartheid with no shades or concessions, then it's certainly up to leaders to take that position. Although I take your point about other people may have other considerations, but we know this phrase about with one man stays silent, it opens the gates to all sorts of evil. And in fact, there's a play on in the West End at the moment called Good, written by J.P. Taylor, a communist, which explores that very aspect. I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to get on a bandwagon.
Thank you.
And so I think it can be really difficult. So one example that I was talking to someone about fairly recently actually is service in the Israeli Defense Forces, which of course is mandatory for Israeli citizens. And if someone were to take the point of view that serving in the IDF is participating in an illegal occupation and they don't want to do it, I'm not intending to open that particular hornet's nest here, but we understand that there are people who hold that view. The question is someone obligated to break the law in order to avoid doing military service? And that's a much more difficult question than it seems, because on the one hand, our instinct sitting here comfortably is if you're being conscripted into a military you consider to be engaging in human rights abuses, obviously you refuse to do it. But on the other hand, this person in Israel is then going to spend some time in prison and have all the associated consequences with the whole of their life that having a criminal record will carry with them. And it's really difficult. And I think with our increasing understanding of privilege as a concept in society needs to come some sensitivity to the fact that people can be put in difficult positions and that doing the right thing is always going to be difficult. Otherwise, we wouldn't spend so much time agonizing over exactly what it is. And again, that's a long way of saying it's complicated, but I think we need to recognize that individual people's circumstances are really, really important and fine-grained in this sort of thing.
can you not obey the law, but also state what the preferred position is? I mean, it's up to other people if they arrest you. You're responsible for your own actions.
You absolutely can obey the law while also stating what your position is. But again, I guess that goes back to the question of effectiveness. Is simply publishing, you know, well, if the suffragettes had stuck to writing newspaper columns saying we think we should have the vote, would they ultimately have been given the vote? I don't know. Probably not as soon as they did, maybe. Again, I can see people who know more about suffragette history frowning at the historicity of that, but you know what I mean in principle.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I
Thank
suppose
you.
really what we want is a lot of people to stand up and say what they really think about key issues, so that it makes it rather impossible for others to arrest them or whatever, you know, the mass of public opinion.
Absolutely. And I think that's where religious movements have a really important role to play. Like 3 Reform rabbis suing the state of Florida, that's big news in Florida, because actually they're the last people that Floridians expect to be standing up and doing that sort of thing. Once the faith leaders, the serious people are doing it, no one's ever accused me of being serious, but I understand that that's a general image that faith leaders have, that really begins to make its mark and make its difference.
Thank you. Tony, you would like to comment?
Well, just to sort of carry on the theme, maybe, about one's duty to follow the law or obey the law. And I had an interesting, I wasn't alone, I was with a number of people who met our Conservative MP about 6 months or a year ago. And it was quite an eye-opener. Let's just say that it didn't go well, the exchange of views, really. But one of the things that the chap had very strong views about was the sovereignty of Parliament, and he as a lawmaker, the ability to sort of forge our own laws and create our own legal framework and, you know, the way we live our lives. And obviously on the face of it, that's quite commendable. The problem, and it did come up in conversation, I can't remember if I led the way, but the problem with some of this is that obviously one doesn't have to go too far back in history and to think of the Nazi period in its worst manifestation to know that countries that determine their own laws on their own terms in their own specific way, with their thoughts peculiar to what they see as right for their country, can produce the most perverse laws and inhumane laws and laws that are truly shocking to us today, which is really the reason. And I'm not going to say that everything that is done on the sort of global stage is all wonderful, but obviously the idea of having an international order, the whole concept of international law largely came about because nations creating their own legal frameworks had a habit of producing some pretty shocking legislative developments, and then the actions that flowed from that, because it was deemed that, oh well, it's okay because it's legal. Obviously the consequences are known to us now, but are truly shocking. So I'm just prolonging this interesting debate about when a law, be careful not to blindly follow every law because it is the law. It's better to think about what is the underlying objective for this law. How is this law only a recent development? It's not been enshrined in law for all time. So has it got some sort of longevity and sort of real lasting integrity to it? Or is it just something that's been introduced by a number of politicians pretty quick, and suddenly something is lawful or it's unlawful? That's why I think liberal Judaism has we obviously, and any religious person has a longer heritage and a longer history to pronounce on, issues that are moral, for example, but you can speak with authority over a longer time span than a politician who perhaps has only been an active lawmaker for a few years.
I think that's right. And actually, you mentioned that you're prolonging the theme, and I think you prolonged it longer than you realize, because what we're talking about goes back to a Talmudic principle, which is called Dina de Malkuta Dina, which means the law of the land is the law. And that's a general Jewish expectation that Jews, wherever they live, must comply with the law of the land. But what I find really fascinating about that is from very, very early times, certainly from medieval times, there was an exception carved into that rule in Jewish law, which said, so long as the law of the land treats groups equally. And it wasn't so long as the law of the land treats Jews equally, it was whatever group it was. So the idea that the law of the land loses its legitimacy if it discriminates between different groups living in a society is a really fascinating one and a really powerful one. And the idea that, yes, it's important to obey the law, and also there are some values that supersede the law, and that if those values are contravened, the law loses its binding character, I think is something that we can definitely take forward as an idea. And I know a lot of work is being done by our rabbinic colleagues in the States at the moment who are thinking about opening sanctuary synagogues or designating their synagogues as sanctuary synagogues, who would, for example, provide sanctuary to, or maybe even provide employment to, undocumented migrants or asylum seekers who are not supposed to be there. And they're looking at whether they can Jewishly justify doing something that is definitely illegal under United States law. And they're going back to that principle that American immigration law, as does British immigration law, does not treat different groups equally in a fair and equitable way. And so I guess that leads me on very briefly to one other distinction, which is not actually a Jewish one, but I think it's an important one. And this is Ronald Dworkin, who wrote an awful lot about civil disobedience. And he classified 3 different sorts of civil disobedience. And one, he said, was doing something that's legally forbidden because you think you should be able to. So Rosa Parks would be the example of that. She felt she should be able to sit down on the bus, so she sat down on the bus. The second sort is refraining from doing something you're legally obliged to because you think you shouldn't be obliged to. So the example of that would be those who were sheltering Anne Frank's family were obliged to turn them over to the Nazis, and they refused to do that because they thought that law was wrong. And the third sort is just sort of generalized disruption. So that's the throwing soup in the National Gallery, or smashing windows because you think that the war in Iraq was wrong, or whatever it would be, which is breaking laws unrelated to the actual issue at hand. And I think certainly it's that third category that's the hardest for us as liberal Jews, because the first two is much easier to rationalize by that idea of higher values and higher responsibility. And maybe fortunately, those are the two most likely to occur in a real life situation. If one of our synagogues found that our cleaner or caretaker did not in fact have permission to work in the UK, it's maybe much easier for us to take the decision to go ahead and keep them and shelter them than it would be for us to endorse a member or a rabbi going around smashing windows on a protest.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Our time is running short, so we have time for maybe one final question or comment, and then Gabriel, you can close the session. So if anybody would want to, is left with a question unasked or a comment. So Gabriel, I'll hand back to you to summarize this learning of tonight.
Thank you. And so I think my main message would be help liberal Judaism to do this. You're all people who've chosen to come to this session because you wanted to hear something about the topic. I think that means you're all people who have in your mind little areas or topics or issues that liberal Judaism could be adopting. And I know I'm going to wind up all your rabbis by saying this, but talk to your rabbis about what they are. Tell them what the issue is. Tell them how we can, in a crookedly righteous way, approach it as a movement, what we can do to make ourselves noisy. I'm glad that Rabbi Aaron is still here, because something he said a long, long time ago when I was a LJY Netzer movement worker was that he wanted LJY Netzer to be more annoying and to promote more annoying issues. And it so happens that just after he said he wanted LJY to be more annoying, we dropped a trolley full of glassware in his synagogue. So I think we lived up to that. But actually, I don't think it should be just LJY who's being annoying. I think we should all be annoying each other. And I think liberal Judaism should be annoying the world beyond, in that positive definition of annoying, of being crookedly righteous and doing what we know is the right thing. And so please think about this. Please be in touch with anyone involved in the running of your communities And thank you so much for joining tonight.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Gabriel. It was, you brought up really fascinating and intriguing issues, and I do hope that we will all take them into account and think of how we can put this into action. And please do circulate your brachot so we can use them as we do our activism. Thank you everybody for joining tonight, and have a lovely and warm Hanukkah with your families, with your communities, with your friends. This is the final session of this learning series, and there will be more to come. So keep reading the emails and the publications so you know when to join next. Thank you again, Gabriel. Thank you everybody for commenting, asking, participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you.